Let me just get the presentation up. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm very sorry about that, but all the preparations, well-led plans don't always come together. Let me just make the slide. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slides we have, and Alan will join us very, very soon. So my name is Julie Beadle Brown. I know some of you who are on the call already. I'm a professor in intellectual and developmental disabilities at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent, and have worked in the field of learning disabilities and autism for over 30 years. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the research we've done about involving people with disabilities in research, as well as some of the research we've done where we've actually involved people. And particularly I'm going to talk about involving people with learning disabilities and people who are autistic. Although generally we find that if you get the systems and you get the processes right for these groups, they will generally be inclusive and allow pretty much most other people to be able to be involved. So I'll get Alan to introduce himself a little bit later when he gets in. What we're going to talk to you a little bit about is why or where the term "nothing about us without us" came in the context of disability, and then I'm going to say very briefly a little bit about an introduction to different ways people with disability have been involved in research, and what we know from a review that we did about involving people with learning disabilities or autistic people as participants in research. And then for the main part of the talk, we will talk about enabling participation and involvement at all levels through the case example of our Living in Fear project that Alan was involved with. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what we do at Tizard in terms of promoting involvement and inclusion in research. And again, Alan is part of a group that we call the RAG group, and I'll explain a little bit more about that a little bit later. Okay. So in terms of "nothing about us without us," it's a phrase that probably we're all extremely familiar with, and it became, if you like, the catchphrase around disability rights in particular for many years, and it was the basis of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability, and people with disabilities themselves played a really large part in the development of the UN Convention. But as some of you are probably already aware, it was first used kind of in an academic sense or in a literature sense as the title of a book by James Carleton in 1998, "Nothing About Us Without Us: Disability, Oppression and Empowerment." And Carleton talks about having first heard the term used in 1993 in South Africa, from leaders of the disabled people of South Africa, who in turn heard it from speaker from Eastern Europe. It turns out that it actually is originally used in Eastern Europe. It was only translated in the kind of 1990s and used in English at that point. But it is a term that has been used much broader context related to democracy. And apparently the term in Polish was used to talk about kind of democracy and involvement of the people in the running of the country, for example. And of course, although for a long time it was used around about the disability movement, it has now also become used in a much wider sense around, for example, identity politics and other kind of populist movements as well. Okay. Sorry, let me just. So the and I wanted, when I was asked to speak today about the involvement of people with disabilities in research, it didn't seem right to do that without somebody who themselves has a disability, and hopefully when Allan joins us, sorry. When Allan joins us, he will tell a little bit about himself. But Allan has a mild intellectual disability, learning disability, and although doesn't access very much in terms of support, and doesn't really have lives on his own, and doesn't have much in terms of support. So obviously people with disabilities in general have been involved, just like I imagine in most the other groups we'll be talking about, have been involved in research in many different ways over it. And they've been involved as participants, as advisors and consultants, and obviously as researchers. And there's quite a lot of research now and guidance about how to involve people with disabilities, and also including people with intellectual disabilities, and more recently autistic people. Sorry. And I'm not going to talk, we're not going to talk a lot about involving people with researchers, but I've put a couple of links there, and when the slides will be sent around, I think, for Hannah, won't they, when at the end. Yes. And will you'll be able to access those. So those are just a few examples for anybody who's interested in that element. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about involving people as participants, and then we'll talk also about the role of people in terms of it as advisors and stakeholders on the project. Just give me 1 second. And obviously, actually, pretty much every method, research method that exists has been used with people, including people with learning disabilities and autistic people. And you can find research that uses focus groups, that has interviewed people, has used surveys and questionnaires to work directly with people and gather data directly from people. And then you'll also find a number of more indirect methods, which are actually quite important and can cause some, can sometimes cause some difficulties, and particularly I'll talk in a little bit about some of the ethical issues that sometimes we meet in involving people. And so those, for example, we sometimes will collect data that is about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but is provided by informants or very occasionally by proxies, so effectively on behalf of rather than just about an individual. The other thing that we do, and actually some of you I've spoken to before about the using observations, and particularly in terms of people with, when we want to look at service and quality of life, look at outcomes, etc. We've used observations a lot. And then also things like reviewing records and paperwork, referral files, information kind of held about people is another method that has been used. So not unlike most other kind of populations, in particular populations in clinical research. Yeah. But the full range of methods have been used. Okay. Now, in 2000, it's quite a long time ago now, but I was having a quick check recently, and there's really not much else since we did this review, and we started off with the terms hard to reach and hard to engage, but in the end we published it under seldom heard, which obviously is a much nicer term in general. But the reality was that we started off trying to relate to trying to look at those who were hard to reach, in the sense of that they were very often not included in research, that getting them involved was hard. And then once you found people, sometimes engaging them in research itself was quite difficult. But that meant that their voices were seldom heard in the research. For Hannah, Alan says that the password isn't working.
Oh dear.